Hi, everyone. Welcome to Accessibility and the New Normal Talks. This is our fourth session called Intersectionality in Action, Equity Within Diversity. I want to thank the sponsors of the program, Access Smithsonian, Theater Development Fund, and the Institute for Human-Centered Design, with special thanks to Beth Seabarth, Betty Siegel, Lisa Carling, Larissa Kaninsky, Christine Trevigno, Valerie Fletcher, and Anupa Sundarajan for all your work and support of this terrific series. My name again is Jan Majewski. I head up the Inclusive Cultural and Educational Projects at IHCD. Our tech and video guru is PJ Moynihan, who you just met, and he and I will manage the logistics side of the conversation, calling on people to keep the conversation running. We have extraordinary speakers today to frame and launch the conversation. Latasha Banks, cultural manager and doctoral student, will be the moderator. Sarah Corin, Office of Raleigh, North Carolina Arts. Sarah Hom, Roundabout Theater Company. Lamondre Pugh, Rue Global Impact, and Storm Smith, producer, BBDOLA, are presenters. And Brandy Turner, Hopkins Center for the Arts at Dartmouth College, is our respondent. Before we turn to our speakers to frame the conversation, here's just a short systems check. Captioning is available. To make it visible, click the CC button at the bottom of the screen. To change the size of the captions, click CC again and select Settings. Today there is also a sign language interpreter on screen. If anyone wants to use the sign language interpreter, feel free to pin the video of the interpreter. Please stay in gallery mode to be able to see Storm and hear the voice interpreter at the same time. If you registered for the session with only a first name, we would really appreciate it if you would change your on-screen name to your first and last name. So if there are 3 Sarahs, and we've got 2 already on our panel, we can specifically identify one person. You can comment or ask a question by putting it into chat, raising your virtual hand on your Zoom screen, raising your physical hand on screen, or if you're using phone without video, please just identify yourself and say, I have a comment, and we'll call on you when you're next in line. We ask all participants to stay muted until they are called. We're trying to make this conversation as accessible as possible. So if everyone stays muted until called, people will know who is talking, and then speech, interpreting, and captioning will be clear. Please introduce yourself with your name every time it's your turn to talk. For the benefit of the interpreter, as well as we are recording the session and maintaining the transcript, so when we post it on IHCD's website, the speakers' identities will be clear for future viewers and readers. The chat at the bottom of the screen can also be used to post resource links and offer new topics for other sessions. We will try to include as many people as possible within the time allowed. If you have a question that is not answered, please include it into the chat for a response later. We're really looking forward to starting this very important conversation, and I now turn it over to Latasha Banks. Thank you.
Please pen Mary Beth Morgan. That's the name of the interpreter. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Latasha Banks, and I am an African-American woman, late 30s. Welcome to Intersectionality in Action, Equity Within Diversity. And we're going to have discussions about mobilizing across the intersections of race, gender, how one chooses to define gender or not, and disability. A little bit of an introduction, so to speak, would be intersectional analysis should not focus solely on differences within or between diverse identity-based groups. Using intersectionality for cross-movement mobilization reveals that being intentional on focusing attention on intersecting identities has the potential to create solidarity and cohesion. We are here to demonstrate how organizing based on an intersectional analysis can help forge alliances between justice groups, racial justice groups, women's rights, and disability rights activists to develop strategies beyond the conversation. We are at a pivotal point where intersectionality applied at the movement building level can identify genuine common ground, create authentic alliances, and more effectively advocate for shared policies. So we will begin this discussion with Sarah Hum.
Great, thank you. Hello, I'm Sarah Hom. I'm the Director of Audience Services for Roundabout Theater Company and a steering committee member for the Museum, Arts, and Culture Access Consortium in New York City. My image description: I am a Chinese American woman, early-ish 40s, with spastic diplegic cerebral palsy, and I walk with a cane. I have long black hair, and today I'm wearing a bright orchid-colored dress. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I have always had to reconcile the fact that my two main identities, as a Chinese American and as a disabled person, are often at odds with my great love for theater. My first career path in the arts was as a costume designer. Now, it wasn't that my parents haven't been supportive, but they really didn't get why I would choose to go in this direction when there are so many stable professions for their ambitious disabled daughter to go into. And that hesitancy is something, that cultural hesitancy is something that was always in the back of my mind as I moved into this world. And, you know, unfortunately, for those of us who identify with minority groups, whatever that minority group might be, we're really used to being the only ones in whatever field it is that we're in. And I think that we use a lot of coded language to speak to how these folks, us, we don't fit in. One thing that really comes to mind is the word intense. I think every theater position I've ever applied for, I've ever interviewed for, has in some way been very proactive and very forward with the idea that this is an intense job, this is an intense world, we keep an intense pace. And I think just the same as how fitting in with the culture becomes code word for maybe you're too ethnic for this position, intense also becomes a code word for, are you sure you can keep up? You're a little bit too disabled for this job. And the interesting thing is, who else does this affect? This intense pace that we keep. It's parents and really everyone. None of us is benefiting from this constant pace of always having to perform, of always having to succeed and not having an opportunity for failure, or not having an opportunity to come to the table and say, this is who I am and this is what I need in order to be successful. Instead, we all have to come to the table and catch up and keep up. And there isn't a lot of freedom to be ourselves in that. And I really think that as we're looking at future planning, and we're talking about equity, as we're all having these conversations about equity and diversity and inclusion, that really we need to remember that disability is a huge dimension that we need to be looking at as we're having these conversations. Because I often find that on a day-to-day basis, my identity as a disabled person is a challenge, and it creates more difficulties than my identity as a Chinese person. And that we should be, sorry?
I'm sorry, we hit our 3-minute mark.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. If I give a cue like this, that means you're coming up to the end of your time. So
sorry.
No need for apologies. As we move forward, I would like to introduce Lamondre.
I am Lamondre Pugh. I'm with Rue Global Impact. I'm the CSO of Rue Global Impact, and I'm also the chairman of Arts Access South Carolina. I'm a Black man, about 47 years old, from South Carolina. I'm absolutely 100% bald, and I have a salt and pepper beard. And very much of what Sarah Hum just spoke about. It is intense, and I have made it a part of my mission to bring all of my intersectionalities to the forefront. And what do I mean by that? In other words, I want to make the fact that I am a Black man with a disability from the South to the mainstream conversation, but not necessarily focusing just on those things. And here is why I say that. I say that because I recognize that so often, particularly as people with disabilities, we are categorized as that special group over there. And when people start thinking about their inclusion and diversity pieces, they very rarely ever consider disability in a serious manner. And I'll give you a prime example of what I mean by that. When this COVID-19 pandemic really began to take effect and we realized that the economy was going to be seriously impacted by it, one of the first things that went in a lot of corporations were the initiatives that they were trying to do regarding disability. Now, here's the thing that they said. They said in order for us to survive as a company, we have to cut back on certain special things that we're doing. But I did not hear them say that they were cutting back on advertising to women. I did not hear them say that they were cutting back on advertising to certain ethnic groups, but they definitely said it's a business imperative that we do this. And even though their literature and their rhetoric had been that disability will forever be a part of the business imperative, apparently it wasn't. And so what I have been trying to do was to bring disability and all of the other groups that I am a part of and all that I am to the forefront. And the reason that I do that is because I believe that if you don't have disability as a part of your broader agenda, then you don't have diversity as a part of your broader agenda. And there are a couple of points that I want to make really quickly in order to how do we effectively do that. First of all, you need to see the diversity. So often I get people who say, hey, Lamondre, when I see you, I don't see a person with a disability. I don't see the wheelchair. What I see is I see someone who's smart. I see someone who's bright. I see someone who's talented. And I'm like, yes, and all of that resides in this wheelchair. That person who's bright, that person who's smart, that person who's talented. So see people, see them. That whole thing of I don't see your disability, kill that. This is what it is. This is who I am. I bring all of that to the table. The second thing is seek to understand. Because here's the thing, we're in a group where people who are really trying. These are people who are really trying to make a difference, but you need to seek to understand that difference before you want to come in and just kind of change things. Seek to understand and then engage with it. And then finally, find a champion and be a champion. What do I mean by that? If you have certain privileges, if you have certain access, you need to use that access to speak for people who don't necessarily have access in that. That means you are the champion. And the other thing is find people who are outside of your circle to speak for you. That's about my time. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamondre. Next, we will have Storm.
Hi, everyone. My name is Storm Smith, and I'm a producer at BBDO LA. Really, BBDO is a worldwide top agency, and I'm focused on advocacy and activism, regarding my workspace in the company. Specifically, a focus on diversity and inclusion and accessibility unit for production side and broadcasting, digital, all of that. So while I'm doing that, I'm also a creative storyteller, and I do a lot of creative collaboration work within the community, within the industry. So I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. I'm a Black woman, I'm deaf, and I have short hair, black short hair, and I'm wearing a denim blouse, long sleeves. and I pronoun is she and her and hers. Okay, I apologize for that. So what you hear right now is my interpreter, Mandy David. Okay, all right, so I've always been an advocate, I think pretty much since college, in my career, just finding my passion regarding with storytelling, producing, but I realized the power of storytelling can really influence change. The narrative is really powerful. What we have, what we can see on the screen, what we see in the media, advertising, everything. But unfortunately, we don't often see ourselves, especially if you're BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, plus multiple identities and sectionality. Within the intersectionality, you really, on the screen, you don't see that. It's a problem. So in the findings of the research, that 55% of people feel uncomfortable by seeing people with disability on the screen. So when I got recruited to work for BBDO worldwide, of course, it changed my life. And it was celebrate the first deaf woman to really get in the advertising space. But immediately I knew I had a responsibility because I'm the only one in. I'm like, oh, what? No, I have to do more. I have to make a difference. I want to make sure to be able to hire more in the future, people with disabilities, so they can come into this space. It's a cutthroat industry. But to let them know it's possible, and at the same time, we can provide the value and the work and the content to generate the critical narratives for who we are, for what we can do, and what we're capable of doing, just anywhere like anyone else. But unfortunately, in society's eyes, we're at the bottom of the barrel, specifically for BIPOC with disability. And it's more impact on Black and Brown. With dark skin, they're targeted for less injustice opportunities for employment, economical, societal, you name it. And on top of that, the dark skin, they get out the door, of course, you know, we're more likely to be killed or harmed. So that's emotionally, that's, you know, that's hard. What can we do? But we need to cherish who we are. And I always practice who I am. And disability does not define me. But hey, I'm here. I can do the work. I will work with you. I will meet you halfway. So I'm constantly making progress at BBDO and making sure we're pushing for inclusion and change, inclusive workspace and inclusive story. Because often I tell them, you know, we have diversity, which is fine. But if we're not incorporating with disability with multiple different backgrounds, then we're not inclusive. So that's where my responsibility comes in. As an advocate, as activism, I've got to do that for the community across all sides. So we're all deserving to be seen and heard and be inclusive in this society and valuable human beings.
Thank you, Storm. Next, we will have Sarah Corn. Sarah?
Hi, my name is Sarah Corn. I'm the Arts Grant Director for the City of Raleigh in North Carolina. I'm a middle-aged, mixed-race, primarily African-American and white, cisgender woman and do not identify as having a disability. I have brown curly hair and am wearing a black dress and pink sweater today. I use she, her, hers as pronouns. I have worked in arts administration for just shy of 30 years at this point. Both accessibility and racial equity work have been constant since the start. I started in theater back in 1991, and among other responsibilities was handled the title of accessibility coordinator. I had no idea what I was doing, and I remember spending a lot of time sitting and listening to people with disabilities explain to me what the theater was doing wrong, what I was doing wrong, and what we needed to do instead. We got more and more right over time, and the experience instilled in me the practice of turning to people with lived experience, working to understand issues from their experience and point of view, and following their lead. Looking back, I now understand that I was learning what allyship was, and I was constantly practicing that role. At the same time I was learning to be an Access ally, I was working for a predominantly white arts organization. To its credit, the theater did cast actors of color and it did produce scripts by Black playwrights occasionally. However, those things didn't happen consistently, so as the only person of color on staff, I learned how to be an activist and how to call the question over and over, so that over time, producing Black scripts and hiring Black directors with appropriate lived experience to direct them, as well as casting actors of color, became a regular part of organizational culture. Back in the 1990s, issues of accessibility and race, the roles of ally and activist were very siloed for me. In 2020, they are not. I've gotten to sit in on discussions about culturally appropriate accommodations for works by artists of color. As the topic of race bubbles up in the field of arts and accessibility, I want to be my activist self and call the question, push people forward into adding the calculation of culture into the accessibility equation. However, I've also gotten to sit in on discussions about how, whether you're deaf or you're Black, you can expect the same issues from the police. And I watch folks who are white crave that same activist role in the racial equity sphere to call the question and push people of color forward into including disability as part of racial equity work. I'm left sorting through a new role for myself at the intersection of disability and race, co-conspirator. I cannot be a racial equity activist in the disability in the disability community without invoking ableist privilege. You cannot be a disability activist in the racial equity community without invoking white privilege. However, we can be allies focused on understanding each other's issues and advocates working for change within our own communities. More importantly, we can focus on collaborating, co-conspiring on the broader equity issues inherent in dominant American culture. Because isn't that really the ultimate goal? Thanks.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Next, we would like to turn it over to Brandy.
Hello, my name is Brandy Turner. I work at the Hopkins Center for the Arts at Dartmouth College. I am a Black woman in my late 30s, and I have glasses, Black hair, and a black and white colored blouse on today. My role in this conversation is just to get the conversation going. So I'll just call out some things that I heard people say that might raise some questions for other people. Just about hiring practices, the words that we use that could remove people from even wanting to try to work in the arts by using language like intense and can you keep up, and just not creating a culture that is really welcoming to everyone, and creating space for failure. Something that I've heard everyone say is that disability is part of DEI initiatives, and if you're not including disability and access into your DEI programs, they're not true DEI programs. And that we all bring multiple identities to whatever space that we're in, and we have to take all of those identities into consideration. I like the idea of seeing people. It's not just that they're Black, or it's not just that they're white, but it's like, I'm a Black woman, like just kind of clarifying like your roles and just knowing who you're actually interacting with and seeing that, and then seeking to understand who it is that you're interacting with. I love the idea of storytelling influencing change, because that's kind of what we're all in the business of doing, whether like across cultural access and across the arts, we're all in the business of telling stories, and stories do make a difference. They build bridges and bring down walls because it shows people's humanities. And then just, it's really important to actually turn to the people that have the experience that you're seeking to understand, were the things that kind of stood out to me. So I think the goal of this conversation is to move it from a conversation to like, what actions can we take to move this place of disability and racial equity forward as cultural arts organizations. Thank you.
So now we'll open the floor up to potential questions. Currently, we have a question. Do we have it in the chat?
Yeah, Latasha, this is Jan Majewski. There's a question in the chat from Betty Siegel.
Okay.
Hi everyone, Betty Siegel here. I am a white woman in my middle ages. I'm wearing blue today because it's a good color for me, and I have a white streak in my black hair. My question is for the entire panel, if you all could think of one, maybe two very practical things that theaters or performing arts and museums, cultural venues can do to be good allies to our colleagues and our patrons who are people of color with disabilities. And I guess I'll throw that to Sarah Holm or Lamondre.
Thank you, Betty. Hi, Sarah Hahn speaking. I really think that one of the ways in which we can shift these past practices is to look at planning, not for access and accessibility, but planning for disabled people. And that can take many different forms, whether that is asking a customer buying tickets directly what it is that would make their experience more comfortable, or if when you're hiring someone, rather than just putting it out there that we of course follow the ADA and we will make any reasonable accommodations, turn it around, ask them what it is, what accommodations they might need, even if there is no obvious disability, no visible disability. That allows that person to recognize that you as an organization are there to help support them as human beings.
This is Lamondre. There's two folds to that, and I agree with what Sarah Hom just said, but there are two folds to it. I think that the planning, is not necessarily for people with disabilities, but planning with people with disabilities. I think that it's important that if it's going to be about me, that I'm at the table when these discussions are being had, and not trying to put it out there in the public and then fix it after the fact. But in the planning process, have that person there. Now, in terms of being welcoming to African Americans with disabilities, I think it goes beyond just accessibility. For me, it's tell our stories. Create a space where we can tell our own stories as well. And it doesn't have to be a situation where it's always, it has to be this way. Listen, as diverse as anybody is, we are as well. So I think that it's important that we see the diversity of our stories represented as well. If you want me to feel welcome, I need to see me. If you want me to be invited, I need to feel like I belong. And I can't belong if I feel like I'm looking at a segregated, exclusive group. So my thing would be, allow it to be a space where my stories are also told. Beyond fences and beyond, all the cliche things that we see all the time.
If there's no one else answering that question, there's a question from Samantha Smink. I'm sorry, Samantha.
Hi, I'm Samantha. I'm a white 33-year-old. It's almost my birthday. I'm wearing a black lace short sleeve shirt today. And I just wanted to hear more on, Sarah, you had commented on culturally appropriate accommodations. And that's a combination of terms I haven't heard before. And so I'm very familiar with accommodations for people with disabilities. That's the world I focus on. But making them culturally appropriate feels like a wonderful piece. And can you extend on some of the examples or situations where you've really been mindful of that?
This is Sarah Corn speaking. Sure. So there's a movement in theater when you're doing shows by and about the African American community to ensure that your ASL interpreters are Black and have cultural knowledge about the specific things that are being discussed in the play. Lamondre brought up fences, which made me smile because there was a big conversation around the audio description of the film because the audio describers left out an action by Denzel Washington where he poured liquor on the ground. And in the African American community, that's a ritual that goes along with what you do when someone passes away. And so there was huge discussion about whether that should have been included or not. But basically, you know, if it's a playwright or a director's intent, it's important to include actions like that. So those are a couple of ways that folks are looking at culturally appropriate accommodations.
This is Jan Majewski. Latasha, I don't want to take your role as moderator. I'm just trying to follow the chat. So if you want to follow the chat and call on people, that's fine, or I can continue to do that and you can jump in as a presenter.
I can call out from the chat as well. Okay, so next we have Valerie Lewis who had a question. Okay, so I'll read it out. Valerie asks, I would like people to think about the process of promoting employment in accessible formats. Many times they are promoted on social media that is not accessible. Forms that are needed to be filled out for employment are not in accessible formats. Even many of the commercials on TV that promote companies and current employment opportunities are not spoken aloud and are not accessible.
This is Storm, and I can answer this one. Yes, that's a huge missing piece, and we actually in marketing and specifically even in recruitment, we need to recruit more people with disability and BIPOC, disability and employment. Currently, right now at BBDO, we're in the action plan of how we can recruit instead of just traditional approach of maybe just, you know, marketing. But you're right, we have to think about those of us, you know, who we can see, but we have to think about people with hearing loss, vision loss, or, you know, maybe completely blind or don't have access, that are missing the opportunity. So our approach, instead of traditional, allowing people just to apply, we want to go to them and partner with local organizations. We want to partner with specific inclusive diversity organizations. For example, oh, sorry, my hearing fell off. For example, LGBTQ, that organization, any specific disability there, we want to work with them, have a talk with them, maybe recruit from there. We are trying to implement what's called a creative residency. So it's our responsibility by engaging and going out there and talking and making sure that the specific accommodations are provided, an interpreter, captioning, CDI deaf certified interpreter, you know, just that support for the vision loss. All of that is how we want to recruit at a disability event called Light, Camera, and Action 2.0 in 2016. So that was my former executive, my former supervisor. He met me there and we spoke, and I had an interpreter. I had no clue. Like, okay, well, let's talk. What is BBDO? So at the time, I worked for Gallaudet University. So we chatted. Like, oh, okay. And about 2 months later, he reached out and said, hey, come to New York City and we'll talk. And so that's how I got hired on. I'm like, oh, so probably it was the smartest move from BBDO's side. So this is something that companies and theater and museums and any corporation space organization can really be assertive, but at the same time, be responsible and unpack your biases, unpack your assumptions, because those can harm the process and you still leave people out that don't have equal access. So, it has to be a different approach now. So yes, definitely.
Does anyone else want to respond to the question?
There is one thing that I would like to add to it, and you know, Storm answered that so beautifully. But I also think another component that we have to look at with this is not just the hiring process and the accessibility of that, but the accessibility of promotion, the accessibility of moving up, because what ends up happening in many cases is that people are hired and people are there and they kind of sit. And rarely do you see people moving into managerial or executive suites. So this is something that I think
I agree.
part of the conversation.
I agree. Promotion, hiring, and retention. Period.
Okay, we have another question from Sarah Buffington. Sarah?
Hi. I work at a place near Pittsburgh. It's Old Economy Village. My name's Sarah Buffington. I'm the curator there, and we represent the Communal Harmony Society, who was a German religious group. They were celibate, all of this, but they were mostly white and German. They kept to their German ways. And how do you make such a place diverse to more people? You know, asking more people to come here and see this place. It's got a very interesting history that a lot of people can identify with, but you know, they were very, very a homogenous group.
This is Sarah Corin. I'll take that question. Your historic site is your historic site, and you have to be true to that. But what you can do is look at your materials related to the types of visits that people can do. Ensure that if you're doing photos of visitors, that you're including folks with disabilities, people of color, people of different ages. Ensure you can look at the language that you're using in terms of how you're interpreting things at your historic site, and make sure that you're not inadvertently using language that would be offensive to folks. You could do some historic research to see if this particular community had thoughts about folks of different cultures or different races, had beliefs about disability that could be useful in that you could incorporate into your interpretation of the site. So you can't make a site that was primarily white German folks be anything but that, and that's fine. That's what the site is. But you can think about how different types of people will experience this site, what they'll be looking for in terms of a welcoming experience, what they'll be looking for in terms of interpretive material. So there's a lot that you can look at, but always stay true to the history of your site.
We have a history of one Black family that became members of the society. And recently we had a Facebook post about this family, and we were really attacked. So I don't know if there's some kind of resource that we can use to make sure that we are using the proper language. But we ended up taking down that Facebook post to try to figure out what is going on.
This is Sarah Corin again. So, you know, if you're making some attempts and you're running into issues, it sounds like you need to start looking at how do you put together an advisory committee to help you guys. You may need to do racial equity assessment, disability, accessibility assessment, some internal work within your organization. But I definitely recommend trying to put together at least one, if not more, advisory committees to help you through this process.
Great. Next, we have a question from Beth Zebar. Beth? Oh, I apologize. It was Latasha speaking.
Hi, this is Beth Zebar. Thank you, Latasha. Yeah, I wanted to ask, have any of you had the experience of working with organizations where they say that they're working on DEI and they'll eventually get to disability, that they see disability as separate and possibly less important?
This is Lamondre. Absolutely, I have. And what's so and in fact, that was a part of the example I gave in the presentation. That happened with a company that I was working with. As soon as the COVID-19 pandemic hit, it was like, well, this is a great initiative, but as a business imperative, we can't move forward with this now. And here's the thing: this is a huge multinational organization that is, in fact, it seems as if their business has ticked up since the pandemic happened. But again, it's the kind of things where people, let me say this, there is another issue that's going on here. There is this concept, and I call it the inclusion illusion, where people talk about inclusion, but when the rubber actually meets the road, you'll see where those priorities really lie. And here's the thing: I recognize that some things, particularly when you talk about accessibility, some things can be costly, some things can, but not all things are. And the thing is to have a plan to do it and actually commit to that. So again, there are a number of organizations out there that really talk a good game, but my whole thing is let's walk it. Let's walk it out and let's see where those priorities really lie. So yes, I have had that experience.
I have a question. How can we be careful to not confine intersectionality to individual experiences or the way systems of power intersect in individual lives? Because oftentimes intersectionality is applied to expose vulnerabilities or exclusions. But how can we counter that perspective and engage intersectionality as a source of empowerment? Anyone? Or if not, we can have.
Hello, this is Valerie Lewis. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this or if this is what you're looking for, but one of the things that I've always tried to do is really focus on the similarities that people have in life. You know, in terms of disability, I'm a person who is legally blind. And I think that, you know, I don't want to be thrown into a pile with everyone else who is legally blind because it doesn't make any sense, first of all. And I think individuality is important to meet individual people's needs. But I think if we can start to look more at the similarities that people have and the similar challenges that people are facing when we're talking about disability, when we're talking about race, when we're talking about, you know, trying to bring all of these things together, I think there's so much that there is in common for people just always being thought of after the fact. Like, how do we, you know, it's not really until someone brings something to someone's attention and then it's like, oh, let's double back and address that issue. And how do we become, as a group, part of the initial conversations, the initial development, the initial creation, even in terms of if we just look at the concept of disability, a lot of the things that I work with in library world, and I work with a lot of community organizations, they will often put out information about a wonderful program. And now we've gotten to the point where we can put it out in English, we put it out in Spanish, but we don't put it out in large print. When disability exists in every race, in every gender, in every color, in every religion, it's a person with a disability. And so we are always backtracking. And I'd love to figure out how we can make sure that all of these things are part of the initial discussion. And I think a lot of that goes back to what was just said about advisory groups. And even if we don't want to use that term to be advised, people take some type of umbrage with it somewhere, a community of people that want to share their ideas and their thoughts and their experiences that will add to a better creation of anything that we are trying to do going forward. I think it's those, we want to be part of those initial discussions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'll tell you, look, this is Lamondre. This is Lamondre. Latasha, I didn't want to answer because I didn't want to dominate. I didn't want to just run my mouth too much. But one of the main things that I say with this, in order to really be empowered, even with representing all of the intersectionalities that we do, is that number one, we've got to be there. We've got to show up. We've got to be seen and heard, and not just in the area of disability or not just in the area of our ethnic background, but we have to be there performing. It's so interesting. So often when I'm speaking at different places, people will come up to me and they'll ask, so you're like the chief diversity officer? No, I'm not. I am the chief sustainability officer. And here's the thing, the reason, and this is why I go back to, we have to fight against the silos. We have to fight against being boxed in, because as soon as someone sees, a person in a wheelchair, or a person who is deaf, or anything like that, they think that becomes the sum total of who they are. When the reality is, I am all of those things. Yes, it is not the defining point, but it's certainly a defining point, and it informs a lot of how I see the world. But so does the fact that I'm wearing a pink shirt today. So does the fact that I'm Black. So there's so many things that inform us. So I think that a part of the way that we become more empowered is by showing up in different areas of life, and not allowing yourself to be put into a silo. And so I think that is an important piece of the puzzle as well. Great question.
I just wanted to say, to follow up quickly to that, it's Valerie Lewis again, that I totally agree. Whenever I speak to something, I speak to the fact that, people always say, oh, wow, despite the fact that you are blind, you are so, oh my God, you've done so much stuff. And people mean that in the most wonderful way, but you just really want to slap them sometimes. And it's just, I love, the other characteristics. Like, I grew up in Brooklyn. I'm obnoxious. I have a loud mouth. I'm skeptical of anything. It doesn't matter what it is. If you give me a rose, I'll be like, oh my God, there's a thorn in this rose, because that's who I am. But immediately it turns to, oh, wow, look what you've done, even though you're legally blind. And it's wonderful that people are compassionate and nice, but it's important to educate people that shouldn't be your distinguishing factor. I think people should know that I'm not a great cook, and I don't clean my house as much as I should, and none of that has anything to do with the fact that I'm legally blind. It just has to do with who I am as a person. So just want to follow up with that.
Oh, that's a great segue into Betty Siegel's question of how do we find people of color with disabilities who can advise us?
Can I, this is Betty Siegel. Can I just amplify that a little bit? Not just advise us, but be our allies. What I fear is that maybe I'm a person who works in an organization like Sarah Hum was mentioning. Sarah, you're often the only person, you know, from your background with a disability. And so I might go to Sarah as a colleague and say, oh, Sarah, I don't know what I'm doing. You know, what should I do about people with disabilities of color? That kind of puts her in a weird spot, don't you think? How do we respect who she is as a whole person? How do we find the right advisors, both within our institutions and externally, so that we aren't putting someone on the spot? Sarah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like you have to represent the entire community of everybody out there with a disability, who is a person of color and a woman, and, you know, please do everybody.
Yeah, sorry, this is Sarah Hom speaking. It's always a challenge, right? Because while we don't want to be the only ones who are being asked, we also don't want to not be asked. And that is always the fine line that I think all of us are walking when we're in large organizations in particular, that we're also not speaking as a monolith, that we, like Lamondre said, is that, you know, we find a champion and we be a champion, that we're also amplifying other people's work, and that as organizations, we are creating space for that to happen, that we're not saying, okay, that's great, but I only have the resources to talk to you, to hire you because you're already employed here, that we really need to be planning for and figuring out how to be able to amplify other voices and how to listen to that expertise. That when I'm saying, okay, thank you for asking, and I'm happy to share my experience, but that is just my experience, and I am speaking as a person with a whole host of other factors in there. And how do we bring in a much larger group and expand who we're talking to? And, you know, I don't just know me, I know plenty of other people too. And now I know all of you fine people on these screens. And so pointing that out and bringing that out. And I also think that we really fear when we're the only one, we fear not having that power sometimes too, and making a misstep. Again, going back to that, there's no room for failure. And so there needs to be that room to say, I don't know everything, but here's a bunch of folks who do, and together we can really speak to a much richer experience.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a question from Scott Artley. Scott?
Hi, my name's Scott Artley. I'm a white male in my early 30s with a beard, black glasses, gray hat, white t-shirt. I work for the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, which is a regional arts funding mechanism for the state of Minnesota. And my question, I'm the accessibility program director, so my job is specifically to advance accessibility in our organization. My question is, as funding resources shrink, I'm hearing more concern from white-led disability service organizations feeling like money is moving toward racial justice at the expense of accessibility. Problematic statement. From BIPOC-led organizations, I'm hearing concerns about funders asking for accessibility to be a priority when racial injustice is already such a burden to navigate. How do we have this conversation in a way that no one is left behind? What practices do you recommend for funders? How do we manage inequity intersectionally when priorities conflict?
As someone with an extensive background in grant management and grant making, I would like to answer this question. We all know that in the grant world or the foundation world, you cannot apply funds everywhere. So sometimes you have to take those steps and figure out how can you resolve each issue reasonably. And so with that, you're saying, okay, maybe you have certain grant lines that go to certain avenues. Does that make sense? And so with that, you can say, okay, we're trying to be inclusive. This is the pot of money. It's a limited pot of money. And these are the initiatives that we have. Then it's up to the organization to then decide, does this grant fit my need? If it doesn't, then they may need to find another organization to fit their need, because every foundation can't do it all. I literally was a part of an organization that received federal COVID funds to then give out to other organizations for COVID relief. And there were so many stories and so many people were impacted in a variety of ways. But we still had to make sure that we dispersed those funds. And we had a limited pot.
This is Janet Bowen, she, her, actually autistic, middle-aged, gray hair, COVID haircut, hiding under lots of bobby pins, white t-shirt, and a really nice necklace to make up for that. My organization received a grant for accessibility excellence, but the one thing that we do keep going back to is not to forget about ethnicity and culture. So it doesn't really, in my head, it doesn't matter what your grant is for. You're the one that's operating it, and so you do it all. Not necessarily, maybe you can't hyper focus, but the point is that, every person with a disability is not the same culture, is not the same race, is not the same, whatever label, we're going to put on it. So, but, we have to really remember that. We can't just be inviting people in and just say, well, we're only going to make an allowance for some of you to be comfortable here. So like one of my colleagues in the program was talking about, is that we are trying to not forget race while we're doing all these other things. So I think it's really, no matter what the grant is for, you still have control over the intent and how you're going to manage it. And to be honest, like whoever your funder is probably going to be really pleased if you are being thoughtful about, what it is for, say, like for us, disabilities, and that you're also being thoughtful about these other issues.
This is Jan Majewski. I hate to interrupt this conversation because it's so extraordinary, and these topics are, we've got a long, long list of questions, but in the interest of time, we've got about a minute left. So Latasha, if you could kind of tie up the conversation, and then we have one announcement to make when you're finished, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. First, I would like to thank all the panelists for their time today. And in conclusion, in acknowledging that all of us have multiple identities and including all of those identities in the organizing process, intersectionality in action can be a powerful tool for representing differences, for respecting differences, and revealing shared values and building potential frameworks. This approach provides a basis for collective action and a model for alternative social relationships rooted in common humanity, borrowing from Lamondre in a previous conversation. Instead of looking at individual identities, let us make intentional efforts to view identities as the whole son of a person, which can create new and authentic alliances that can lead to more inclusive, focused, and effective efforts for social change. Intersectionality as a theory and practice for social change can and should be used as a critical tool in struggles for social justice that seeks to include us all. Thank you, everyone.